Sometimes the people we refuse to hear are the ones holding the truth that can destroy us. Snow drifted slowly across Manhattan like ash from a silent fire, covering the sidewalks in thin white layers that reflected the city lights in soft gold. Outside Le Claire restaurant, black luxury cars lined the curb while men in tailored coats stepped carefully through the cold, carrying briefcases worth more than most people's monthly rent. Inside, crystal chandeliers glowed against polished marble floors while the quiet sound of piano music floated above conversations spoken in low, expensive voices. Claire Bennett tightened the strings of her dark green apron behind her back and glanced toward the clock near the kitchen entrance. 6:43. 7 minutes before the Callaway reservation. Her stomach tightened instantly. Across the room, waiters adjusted wine glasses and folded linen napkins with nervous precision. Even the manager looked tense tonight, because whenever Ethan Callaway walked into a room, the room changed around him. Claire picked up 2 steaming plates carefully before moving toward table 12 near the windows. Her movements stayed graceful despite the exhaustion buried in her bones after another double shift. Long hours had become normal years ago. Single mothers did not have the luxury of collapsing when life became difficult. "Mommy." Claire turned immediately at the small voice near the hallway. Sophie stood there wrapped in a purple sweater 2 sizes too big, clutching her coloring book against her chest. Claire's expression softened instantly. "Sweetheart, what did I tell you? Stay in the office until my shift ends." Sophie lowered her eyes. "I was lonely." Guilt pressed quietly against Claire's chest. The babysitter canceled again 30 minutes before work. Rent was due in 3 days. And Manhattan did not care if someone was tired. Claire crouched carefully in front of her daughter and brushed loose curls away from Sophie's face. "Just 1 more hour, okay? Then pizza night." Sophie's eyes brightened slightly. "With extra cheese?" "Extra cheese. And maybe chocolate cake if you let Mommy survive tonight." Sophie giggled softly before hugging Claire around the neck. The little girl smelled faintly like crayons and strawberry shampoo. Claire closed her eyes for one brief second, grounding herself in the only thing that had kept her alive emotionally for the last 6 years. Her daughter, Miss Bennett. Claire stood immediately at the sharp voice behind her. Martin, the restaurant manager, adjusted his tie nervously while glancing toward the entrance. "The Callaway party just arrived. I need your best service tonight." Claire nodded automatically. "Of course. And Claire." His voice lowered carefully. "Do not make mistakes with this table. Ethan Callaway owns half the real estate on this block." Claire forced a polite smile. "I understand." But her heartbeat had already begun moving unevenly beneath her ribs. Because 6 years ago, before Ethan Callaway became a headline worth billions, before magazines called him Manhattan's coldest billionaire, he had simply been Ethan. A man laughing barefoot beside the ocean while carrying her shoes in one hand. A man who kissed her forehead while she slept. A man who promised to call Monday morning. Claire swallowed carefully and straightened her apron once more. Then the front doors opened. The restaurant shifted instantly. Conversations softened. Heads turned discreetly. Ethan Callaway entered surrounded by investors in dark winter coats, snow melting slowly across broad shoulders wrapped in charcoal wool. He looked older now, sharper somehow. The softness she remembered had disappeared beneath expensive suits and controlled silence. But his eyes remained exactly the same. Cold blue when guarded. Dangerous when emotional. Claire forgot how to breathe for half a second. Ethan removed his gloves slowly while speaking to one of the investors beside him, completely unaware that the woman standing 20 feet away had once changed the entire direction of his life. Martin hurried toward them personally. "Mr. Callaway, welcome back to Le Claire." Ethan nodded politely before his gaze lifted across the dining room. And stopped. Claire felt the moment physically. Recognition flickered faintly across his face before confusion replaced it almost immediately. 6 years change people. Pain changed them faster. "Your usual table is ready," Martin continued smoothly. Ethan's eyes remained on Claire 1 second too long. Then he looked away. "Thank you." Claire forced herself to move. Professional. Calm. Invisible. She carried menus toward the table while her pulse thundered loudly enough to drown out the piano music. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said softly. "Welcome to Le Claire." Ethan looked up again the moment she spoke. This time recognition hit harder. His expression tightened almost invisibly. "Claire." The sound of her name in his voice after 6 years nearly shattered her composure. But she only nodded politely. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway." Silence spread briefly across the table. One of the investors glanced between them curiously. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face carefully now. "I did not know you worked here." Claire lowered her eyes toward the menus. "Most people do not." Something unreadable crossed his expression. Before he could speak again, Sophie suddenly appeared near the hallway entrance, clutching her coloring book against her chest. Claire's blood turned cold instantly. Sophie had inherited Ethan's eyes completely. The same impossible blue. The same quiet intensity. And children noticed familiar things before adults allowed themselves to. Sophie looked directly at Ethan, then froze. Ethan frowned slightly at the little girl standing beside the hallway. Sophie stared at him with innocent confusion before slowly looking toward Claire. "Mommy," she whispered softly enough that only Claire heard it. "Why does that man look exactly like the picture in your drawer?" The tray nearly slipped from Claire's hands. Across the table, Ethan's expression changed completely. The entire table went silent so quickly that Claire could suddenly hear the faint clink of ice against crystal glasses 3 tables away. Ethan Calloway remained completely still, his blue eyes locked on Sophie as though the child standing near the hallway had just spoken a language only he understood. Sophie looked back at him innocently, still clutching her coloring book against her chest. "Mommy," she whispered again. Claire forced herself to breathe despite the pressure building inside her ribs. "Sweetheart, go back to the office for me." Sophie frowned slightly. "But now, Sophie." The sharpness in Claire's voice startled even herself. Sophie lowered her gaze immediately before quietly disappearing down the hallway toward the manager's office. Claire watched her leave, every muscle in her body tense. Then she turned back toward the table. Ethan had not looked away from her once. One of the investors cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Calloway, should we review the Singapore numbers before the merger meeting tomorrow?" Ethan ignored him completely. "How old is she?" The question landed softly but heavily between them. Claire tightened her grip on the tray. "Your appetizers will arrive shortly." "Claire." His voice dropped lower now. More dangerous because it carried recognition instead of confusion. "How old is the little girl?" Claire stared at him for one suspended second. 6 years ago, she would have answered immediately. 6 years ago, she trusted him with every vulnerable part of herself. But that woman no longer existed. "Excuse me," she said quietly before turning away from the table. "Claire." Ethan stood this time. Chairs shifted softly around him as conversations nearby slowed with curiosity. Wealth followed attention wherever it went. Claire kept walking toward the kitchen doors, pulse pounding hard enough to make her dizzy. She heard footsteps behind her almost immediately. "Claire, wait." She pushed through the kitchen doors into the quieter hallway leading toward the storage offices. The sounds of the restaurant softened behind thick walls while fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. Ethan stopped a few feet away from her, breathing unevenly for the first time since entering the restaurant. Claire folded her arms tightly across herself. "You should go back to your table." Ethan studied her carefully now. Older exhaustion lined her face in ways he did not remember. Her hair was pinned back simply. No jewelry except a tiny silver necklace resting against her collarbone. Yet somehow she still looked exactly like the woman he had spent years trying unsuccessfully to forget. "You disappeared," he said finally. Claire laughed softly at that. Not cruelly, just tired. Interesting version of history. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I called your apartment for weeks. And I called your office for months." Silence hit harder this time. Claire looked away first. "You should return to your investors." "Not until you answer my question." She already knew which question he meant. Her heartbeat turned slow and painful. "That little girl," Ethan continued carefully. "Why does she look at me like she knows me?" Claire swallowed once. Children notice things adults ignore. "Claire." His voice softened slightly now. "Is she mine?" The hallway suddenly felt too small, too warm. Claire looked down at the floor tiles instead of his face, because looking at him hurt in ways she had trained herself not to feel anymore. 6 years of surviving without him had required emotional discipline sharper than knives. "You do not get to ask that question like this," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer instinctively. "Then tell me how I should ask it." Claire finally looked up at him then. Really looked. The expensive suit. The controlled posture. The billionaire confidence that had only grown harder with time. But beneath all of it sat something fractured now. Fear. Real fear. You should have listened 6 years ago, she said quietly. Ethan went still. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, plates clattered faintly while the restaurant continued moving forward like nothing life-changing was happening in the hallway beside it. But Claire's entire world had already changed once because of this man. I waited outside your office building in the rain for 3 hours, she continued softly. I called until your assistant threatened to contact security. I wrote letters. I tried everything. Ethan stared at her without speaking. Claire felt tears threatening now and hated herself for it. She had promised long ago never to cry because of Ethan Calloway again. Then one day I stopped trying, she whispered. Because I realized people like you always have doors that women like me cannot get through. Ethan's expression shifted painfully. Claire, I never received any letters. She smiled bitterly through the ache building in her chest. Maybe billionaires lose mail differently than normal people. Do not do that. His voice sharpened slightly. Do not turn this into some story about class. Claire's eyes flashed instantly. You think it was not? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Ethan ran one hand slowly through his hair, frustration finally cracking through his calm exterior. If that child is mine, you had no right to keep her from me. Claire inhaled sharply at that. The words hit exactly where old wounds still lived. Keep her from you, she repeated softly. I carried her alone for 9 months while working double shifts. I held her through fevers alone. I watched her ask why she did not have a father while other kids did. Her voice trembled now despite every attempt to control it. Do not stand there in a $7,000 suit and tell me I kept anything from you. Ethan looked genuinely shaken for the first time. Claire pressed trembling fingers briefly against her eyes before forcing herself upright again. Calm, dignified. Survive first. Cry later. That had become her entire life. Mommy. Sophie's tiny voice suddenly echoed from the office doorway nearby. Claire turned immediately. Sophie stood there clutching a folded drawing, blue eyes wide with uncertainty. Are you crying? Claire forced a smile instantly. No, sweetheart. But children always knew. Sophie looked from Claire to Ethan quietly before stepping closer. Then she held the drawing toward Ethan with innocent hesitation. I made this yesterday, she whispered. Ethan accepted the paper slowly. 3 stick figures stood beneath a badly drawn yellow moon holding hands beside the ocean. 1 tall man, 1 woman, 1 little girl between them. At the top, written in crooked purple crayon, were 4 words that made the air leave Ethan's lungs completely. My family at the beach. Claire closed her eyes the moment she saw his expression change. For a long moment, Ethan Calloway forgot where he was. The hallway outside the restaurant kitchen disappeared completely beneath the weight of 4 crooked words written in purple crayon. My family at the beach. His eyes remained fixed on the drawing while Sophie stood quietly in front of him, waiting for a reaction no child should have needed to wait for. Claire turned away slightly, pressing trembling fingers against her lips before forcing herself back under control. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly felt too bright, too unforgiving. Ethan stared at the stick figure meant to be him. Tall, standing beside Claire beneath a badly drawn yellow moon. His chest tightened painfully because he remembered that beach. The exact one. Long Island. Early September. Claire laughing while cold ocean water soaked the bottom of her jeans. He remembered carrying her shoes because she kept slipping on the rocks. He remembered the way she looked at him before life complicated everything. Sophie shifted awkwardly beneath the silence. Mommy says I draw weird hands, she whispered softly. Ethan looked up at her immediately. No, his voice sounded rougher than before. The hands are perfect. Sophie smiled a little at that. Claire closed her eyes briefly as if hearing tenderness in Ethan's voice physically hurt her somehow. Maybe it did. Ethan carefully folded the drawing once before crouching slightly to Sophie's level. He noticed it instantly now. The tiny freckles across her nose. The stubborn little crease between her brows. The same blue eyes staring back at him with impossible familiarity. Genetics could be cruel that way. They turned secrets into mirrors. How old are you, Sophie? He asked quietly. Sophie held up 6 fingers proudly. I turned 6 in October. Ethan did the math automatically. October. 6 years. His stomach dropped hard enough to make him dizzy. Claire stepped forward immediately, sensing the shift in him. Sophie, sweetheart, go wait inside for Mommy. Sophie hesitated this time. Are you mad? Ethan looked at her so quickly that the question visibly struck him. No, he answered softly. Not at you. Sophie studied him for another second before quietly disappearing back into the office again. The moment she vanished around the corner, silence rushed back into the hallway heavier than before. Ethan stood slowly, still holding the drawing. 6 years, he said quietly. Claire folded her arms tighter across herself. Yes. Ethan looked at her carefully now as though seeing her fully for the first time tonight. The exhaustion beneath her makeup. The invisible strain carried in her posture. The quiet strength people only develop after surviving alone for too long. Why did you never come to me? Claire laughed softly again. Bitter this time. You really still believe I did not try? Claire, no. Her voice finally cracked slightly beneath the pressure she had spent years controlling. You do not get to stand here now acting wounded when I spent years screaming into closed doors. Ethan's jaw tightened. I would have known. Would you? She shot back instantly. Because your assistant knew. Your security team knew. Your front office knew. Ethan blinked once. What? Claire looked away toward the floor before continuing more quietly. I came to your office when I was 4 months pregnant. Ethan went completely still. I waited downstairs almost all day because they kept saying you were busy. Her voice softened painfully with memory. Then eventually one of your assistants came down and told me Mr. Calloway was not interested in reconnecting with temporary relationships. Ethan's face drained of color. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. I remember she looked embarrassed while saying it. Like even she knew it sounded cruel. Ethan stared at her without speaking. Shock moved visibly across his expression now. Real shock. Claire, I never told anyone to say that. I know that now, she whispered. Back then I did not. The words settled heavily between them. Somewhere beyond the hallway walls, glasses clinked softly while wealthy strangers laughed over wine, completely unaware that an entire family was quietly breaking apart 2 feet away from the kitchen freezer. Ethan ran one hand across his face slowly, struggling to process 6 lost years in the span of 5 brutal minutes. What was her name? He asked finally. Claire frowned slightly. The assistant. Claire hesitated. Rebecca, I think. Ethan's expression hardened immediately in a way Claire remembered too well from years ago. Controlled anger. Cold enough to freeze rooms. She worked for my mother before transferring to my office. Claire looked up sharply at that. Ethan seemed to realize something terrible at the exact same moment she did. Silence again, but different now. Colder. More dangerous. Claire felt exhaustion spreading through her body like heavy rain. Please go back to your dinner, Ethan. Hearing his first name after years made something flicker painfully across his face. You think I can sit through a merger meeting after this? Claire looked at him carefully then. People like you always finish the meeting first. Ethan inhaled slowly at that. Because she was not entirely wrong. His entire world had trained him to prioritize business above emotion. Profit above vulnerability. Results above people. But standing here tonight beside industrial kitchen lights while holding a child's drawing, none of those things felt remotely important anymore. Claire. His voice lowered. Softer now. I need to know the truth. Claire's eyes glistened immediately, though she fought the tears with visible determination. The truth? She whispered. The truth is Sophie spent 6 birthdays blowing out candles without a father there. Ethan looked physically struck by the sentence. Claire forced herself to continue before emotion swallowed her completely. The truth is she asks every Christmas why other children have dads at school events. Her voice trembled harder now despite every effort to stay composed. The truth is I stopped hating you years ago because hating someone takes energy single mothers do not have. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the drawing in his hands. Claire. And the worst part, she continued quietly. Even after all these years, I still kept your photograph because I wanted Sophie to know where her eyes came from. Ethan looked up immediately. The hallway suddenly felt painfully small around them. Claire pressed trembling fingers beneath her eyes quickly, ashamed of the tears threatening again. I should get back to work. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. Do not walk away from me again. Claire froze, then slowly turned back toward him with tears finally slipping free despite every ounce of pride still holding her together. I never walked away from you, she whispered. You just never listened. Snow continued falling over Manhattan long after Ethan left the restaurant that night. Thick white flakes drifted past the windows of his Blacktown car, while the city blurred into silver and gold beyond the glass. Traffic moved slowly through Fifth Avenue, headlights glowing against wet pavement like broken reflections. But Ethan barely noticed any of it. Sophie's drawing still rested in his hands, slightly wrinkled now from how tightly he had been holding it for the last 20 minutes. My family at the beach. For simple words written by a child who had no idea she had just shattered the carefully controlled life of one of the most powerful men in New York. Sir. The driver glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. Home. Ethan stared out the window without answering immediately. Home. The words suddenly felt strange. Empty. His penthouse overlooking Central Park had marble floors, private elevators, and windows stretching 30 feet high into the skyline. Yet tonight the only place replaying in his mind was a fluorescent hallway beside a restaurant kitchen where Claire Bennett stood crying quietly while trying not to fall apart in front of him. Sir. Ethan blinked once. The office. The driver hesitated slightly. It is almost 11. The office. 20 minutes later, Ethan stepped into the silent executive floor of Callaway Holdings. The city glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows while soft automatic lights illuminated polished black marble and cold modern furniture. Normally the building comforted him. Structure always had. Control. Predictability. But tonight the silence inside the office felt unbearable. Ethan loosened his tie slowly while walking toward his desk. Then he stopped completely when his eyes landed on a framed photograph near the bookshelf. Himself at 30. Standing beside his mother at a charity gala. Rebecca Hart standing behind them holding event folders against her chest. Ethan stared at the image for several seconds before grabbing his phone immediately. Find me everything connected to Rebecca Hart's employment records, he told his assistant the moment she answered. Tonight. Mr. Callaway, it is almost midnight. Tonight. He hung up before she could respond. Then he sat heavily behind his desk, elbows resting against polished wood while Sophie's drawing remained spread open in front of him. 6 years old. He tried to imagine it. First words. First steps. Birthdays. School mornings. Fevers. Christmas mornings. Every moment gone. Not because Claire hid his daughter, but because somewhere along the way, powerful people made decisions for him while he remained too distracted building an empire to notice his own life disappearing. Ethan leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. And immediately another memory surfaced. Claire standing barefoot beside the Atlantic Ocean 6 summers ago while wine tangled her hair across her face. You know what scares me about rich people? She had asked quietly that night. Ethan remembered laughing softly. What? Claire looked toward the waves instead of him. They stopped listening the moment life becomes inconvenient. Ethan opened his eyes sharply now, because she had warned him long before either of them understood how true those words would become. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Come in. His assistant entered carefully carrying a thin file folder. You asked for Rebecca Hart's records. Ethan accepted the file immediately. His expression darkened page by page. Rebecca had transferred from Margaret Callaway's private office directly into Ethan's executive staff 6 years ago. 3 months later, she resigned suddenly with a confidential severance agreement attached. Ethan's pulse slowed dangerously. Where is she now? He asked quietly. Connecticut. Married. 2 children. Ethan closed the folder slowly. Set a meeting tomorrow morning. With Rebecca? No, his eyes lifted coldly toward the skyline. With my mother. Across Manhattan, Claire sat quietly beside Sophie's bed while soft rain mixed with snow against the apartment windows. The tiny bedroom glowed gently beneath a small nightlight, shaped like a moon. Sophie slept curled beneath blankets, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Claire brushed loose curls away from her daughter's forehead with trembling fingers. The apartment heater rattled softly through old pipes while exhaustion settled heavily into every part of her body. Tonight had reopened wounds she spent years carefully stitching closed. Mommy. Claire looked down immediately. Sophie's sleepy blue eyes blinked toward her from beneath the blankets. You are still awake? Sophie nodded slightly. Was the man at the restaurant my daddy? Claire's chest tightened painfully. Children deserved honesty. But honesty sometimes hurt too much for adults to survive cleanly. Claire forced a small smile despite the ache rising inside her. Why would you ask that? Sophie looked toward the window quietly. Because he looked at me like he already loved me. Claire stopped breathing for a second. Then tears finally slipped free before she could stop them. Sophie immediately pushed herself upright beneath the blankets. "Mommy, I am sorry." Claire shook her head quickly and wiped beneath her eyes. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong." Sophie hesitated before asking softly, "Did he know about me?" Claire looked toward the dark apartment wall instead of answering immediately. 6 years of pain sat inside that silence. 6 years of believing Ethan simply chose ambition over them. "I do not know anymore," she whispered finally. Sophie studied her mother carefully the way children sometimes did when they sensed adults were carrying invisible sadness too heavy to explain. Then she reached out her tiny hand. Claire took it instantly. "He looked lonely," Sophie whispered. Claire closed her eyes. Because somehow, despite everything, the child was right. The next morning arrived cold and gray over Manhattan. Ethan stood inside his mother's private dining room overlooking Central Park while untouched coffee cooled beside him. Margaret Calloway entered precisely at 8:15, wearing cream silk and quiet authority like armor. "Ethan," she said smoothly. "Your assistant claimed this was urgent." Ethan remained standing beside the window, hands in his pockets. "Did you know Claire Bennett was pregnant 6 years ago?" The silence that followed answered him before Margaret spoke at all. Slowly, carefully, she set down her coffee cup. Ethan turned toward her fully now. "You knew?" Margaret inhaled once. "Ethan, you knew," he repeated quietly. And for the first time in years, Margaret Calloway looked uncertain. Margaret Calloway had spent most of her life controlling rooms without raising her voice. Charity boards listened when she spoke. Politicians waited for her approval. Entire business partnerships shifted based on a single expression crossing her face during dinner parties overlooking Manhattan skylines. But this morning, standing across from her son inside the private dining room of the Calloway penthouse, she looked older somehow, smaller beneath the pale winter light pouring through the windows. Ethan watched her carefully, his jaw tight with controlled disbelief. "How long?" he asked quietly. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the untouched coffee between them. "Ethan, how long did you know Claire was pregnant?" Silence stretched heavily across the room. Outside, snow rested quietly over Central Park while black cars moved slowly beneath frozen trees 30 floors below. Finally, Margaret inhaled once. "I found out shortly after she came to your office." Ethan stared at her without blinking. "You knew for 6 years." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup. "I was trying to protect you." Ethan laughed softly at that. Not because anything felt funny, because sometimes pain became too sharp for normal reactions. "Protect me from what?" Margaret looked toward the skyline instead of him. "You were about to take over the company after your father died. Investors already questioned whether you were ready. One scandal at that time could have damaged everything your father built." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "A child is not a scandal." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. To people in our world, unexpected things become liabilities very quickly. Ethan stepped away from the window slowly. "Our world." He repeated the words quietly like something bitter. "Do you hear yourself?" Margaret looked up now. "You were grieving your father. Working 18-hour days. Barely sleeping. And then suddenly there was a waitress claiming she was pregnant with your child." Ethan's eyes darkened immediately. "Claire never claimed anything. She came to tell me the truth." Margaret's silence confirmed it. Ethan looked away sharply, pressing one hand against his mouth for a second as realization settled deeper into his chest. "What exactly did you do?" Margaret hesitated too long. "Mother." Her voice lowered carefully. "I asked Rebecca to handle it." Ethan turned back slowly. "Handle it?" The words sounded dangerous now. "Rebecca told Claire you were not interested in continuing the relationship." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "You let her believe I abandoned her." Margaret's composure cracked slightly for the first time. "I thought it was temporary. I thought eventually things would calm down and we could approach the situation carefully." Ethan shook his head slowly like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. 6 years, Mother." His voice broke quietly beneath the weight of it. "You stole 6 years from me." Margaret looked genuinely shaken now. "I never intended for this to happen." Ethan's eyes flashed with pain sharper than anger. "But it did." Silence settled across the room again. Heavy. Final. Ethan suddenly remembered Sophie's face the night before. The cautious hope in her eyes when she asked if he was angry. The innocent way she handed him the drawing like she already trusted him without understanding why. 6 birthdays. 6 Christmas mornings. 6 years of bedtime stories and school mornings and scraped knees and lost teeth. Gone. Not because Claire kept secrets. Because power had decided truth was inconvenient. Ethan looked toward the skyline again before speaking quietly. Did my father know? Margaret went pale immediately. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew too. Margaret's voice trembled slightly now. Only near the end. Ethan closed his eyes hard. And he said nothing? He told me not to interfere anymore. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. Margaret looked devastated now beneath the weight of memory. Your father wanted to contact Claire himself before he passed away. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. What? But then his condition worsened. Her voice softened painfully. Everything happened so fast after that. Ethan turned away sharply, grief and anger colliding inside him all at once. His father knew. His father tried to fix it. But death moved faster than truth sometimes. Margaret stepped forward carefully. Ethan, I truly believed I was helping you. He looked back at her then with exhausted sadness instead of rage. Somehow that hurt worse. That is the problem, he whispered. You never asked what I wanted. Across Manhattan, Claire stood beside the apartment window, buttoning Sophie's winter coat carefully while pale morning light filled the tiny kitchen. Snow continued drifting softly outside, covering parked cars and fire escapes in quiet white layers. Sophie held her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm while chewing sleepily on a piece of toast. Do you think the restaurant man liked my drawing? She asked suddenly. Claire paused briefly before answering. I think he did. Sophie smiled faintly. He looked sad after he saw it. Claire forced herself to continue fixing the crooked scarf around her daughter's neck. Sometimes adults get sad when they realize they missed important things. Sophie considered this seriously in the way only children could. Like school plays. Claire swallowed hard. Something like that. A soft knock suddenly echoed through the apartment. Claire frowned immediately. Nobody visited this early. Rent collectors usually waited until afternoon. She crossed the small living room carefully before opening the door. Ethan stood there holding 2 paper coffee cups while snow melted slowly across the shoulders of his dark wool coat. Claire froze completely. He looked different this morning. Less polished somehow. Tired in a way expensive suits could not hide. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan held one coffee toward her quietly. You still take it with vanilla and too much cream? Claire stared at the cup in stunned silence. Because 6 years later, he still remembered her coffee order. Sophie suddenly appeared behind Claire holding her rabbit tightly. Her blue eyes widened instantly. Restaurant man. Ethan looked down at her, and something inside his expression softened immediately despite the exhaustion still shadowing his face. Good morning, Sophie. Sophie studied him carefully. Mommy says strangers should not come inside apartments. Claire nearly closed her eyes from embarrassment. But Ethan only nodded seriously. Your mother sounds smart. Sophie seemed satisfied by that answer. Claire tightened her grip against the doorframe slightly. What are you doing here? Ethan looked back at her quietly now, trying to listen this time. Claire stood motionless beside the apartment door while cold winter air slipped quietly through the narrow opening between her and Ethan. The hallway smelled faintly like old radiator heat and wet wool coats. Somewhere downstairs, a dog barked once before silence returned to the building. Ethan still held the paper coffee cup toward her patiently, snow melting slowly into dark spots across his coat sleeves. Sophie peeked around Claire's arm curiously, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. Do billionaires always show up before breakfast? She asked innocently. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Ethan surprised her by smiling softly. Only the nervous ones. Sophie considered this answer very seriously. Then she stepped aside with the solemn importance only 6-year-olds could carry. Okay, you can come inside. But Mommy does not like shoes on the carpet. Claire stared at her daughter in disbelief. Ethan nodded immediately. Understood. He removed his shoes without hesitation near the doorway before stepping carefully into the tiny apartment. Claire watched him quietly then. Men raised around wealth usually carried invisible distance into smaller spaces. But Ethan looked around not with judgment. With attention, the worn books stacked beside the couch. Sophie's crayons spread across the coffee table. The old heater rattling unevenly beneath the window. Evidence of survival lived everywhere here. Sophie climbed onto the couch beside the Christmas blanket still folded there from last winter. Mommy burns pancakes sometimes, she informed Ethan seriously. Claire sighed softly. Sweetheart, But only the first one, Sophie continued. After that she gets better. Ethan glanced toward Claire while setting the coffee cups carefully onto the counter. Honestly, that sounds reasonable. Claire tried not to react to how natural his voice sounded inside her apartment. Like part of him already belonged near these walls, even when he did not. Ethan looked around again slowly before speaking quieter now. You raised her here? Claire folded her arms tightly. Most of the time. Ethan nodded once though something painful moved briefly across his face. He noticed the tiny hallway leading towards Sophie's bedroom. The grocery coupons held to the refrigerator with magnets. The carefully folded second-hand school uniforms drying near the heater vent. Every detail whispered the same truth. Claire had done all of this alone. Sophie suddenly slid off the couch holding a purple crayon drawing. Do you want to see my fish? Ethan crouched slightly. You have a fish? Sophie nodded proudly before showing him the paper. 3 badly colored orange circles floated inside what appeared to be a blue rectangle. This one is Mr. Pickles because he looks confused all the time. Ethan studied the drawing with complete seriousness. I respect that. Sophie giggled instantly. Claire watched from the kitchen quietly, unsettled by how quickly her daughter relaxed around him. Children usually sensed danger long before adults did. But Sophie looked at Ethan like something missing had finally entered the room. Ethan looked back at Claire eventually, expression gentler now. Can we talk? Claire hesitated before nodding once toward the tiny kitchen table. Sophie immediately spoke up. I can color quietly. Claire touched her daughter's hair softly while passing by. No listening to adult conversations. Sophie gasped dramatically. I never do that. Ethan nearly smiled again before sitting carefully at the kitchen table across from Claire. Morning light spilled through the apartment window, pale and cold against worn countertops and chipped ceramic mugs. Ethan wrapped both hands loosely around his untouched coffee cup. For a few seconds neither spoke. Because some truths changed shape once spoken aloud. I talked to my mother. Ethan finally said quietly. Claire looked down immediately. Of course he did. Powerful families always handled pain behind closed doors first. And Ethan exhaled slowly. Everything you said was true. Claire stared at the table silently. Hearing validation should have felt satisfying after 6 years. Instead, it only made her tired. Ethan studied her face carefully. Why did you never come back after Sophie was born? Claire laughed softly without humor. You still think women enjoy humiliating themselves in front of billionaire office buildings? Ethan lowered his gaze. Claire continued before emotion stopped her. I spent months convincing myself maybe you were just busy. Maybe your assistants never gave you my messages. Her voice softened painfully. Then eventually, I realized people who want to stay do not disappear. Ethan looked physically affected by the sentence. Claire, I swear to you, I never knew. She finally looked at him then. I believe you now. The quiet honesty in her answer seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. Sophie hummed softly in the living room while coloring fish with purple crayons. Ordinary sounds. Yet Ethan kept glancing toward her like he was terrified she might disappear if he looked away too long. Claire noticed immediately. She likes grilled cheese sandwiches cut diagonally, she said quietly before she could stop herself. Ethan blinked. What? Claire looked down at her coffee cup. You keep looking at her like you were trying to memorize everything at once. Silence. Then Ethan asked softly, what else? Claire hesitated. She hates thunderstorms, but pretends she does not because she thinks brave people are not supposed to be scared. Ethan smiled faintly through visible emotion. Sounds familiar. Claire ignored that. She sleeps with the hallway light on after bad dreams. Ethan listened carefully to every word like someone starving beside water. Claire swallowed hard before continuing quieter now. And every birthday she wishes for the same thing before blowing out candles. Ethan already knew the answer somehow. Still, he asked, what? Claire looked towards Sophie across the apartment. A father. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Sophie suddenly looked up from the couch. Mommy, can Restaurant Man come to my school play next month? Claire froze instantly. Ethan looked stunned. Sophie tilted her head curiously. Everybody else has someone coming. The room fell very quiet. Claire prepared herself to redirect the conversation gently before Sophie's feelings got hurt. But Ethan spoke first. If your mother says yes, he answered softly, I would really like to come. Sophie smiled so brightly that something inside Claire cracked a little despite herself. Ethan looked toward Claire carefully after that. Not demanding. Not assuming, just waiting. And for the first time in 6 years, Claire realized the man sitting across from her was no longer asking how to escape responsibility. He was asking how to belong. 3 weeks later, Manhattan stood buried beneath the quiet heart of December. Christmas lights stretched above crowded sidewalks while storefront windows glowed gold against the early winter darkness. Snow gathered softly along the edges of brownstones and taxi roofs as the city hurried toward the holidays beneath scarves and cold breath. Inside Claire's apartment, cinnamon candles mixed with the smell of grilled cheese sandwiches while Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor cutting paper snowflakes with dangerous concentration. "This one looks like Texas," she announced proudly. Claire glanced over from the tiny kitchen. "That looks absolutely nothing like Texas." Sophie narrowed her eyes seriously. "Art is subjective." A soft laugh escaped Claire before she could stop it. She had been doing that more lately, smiling unexpectedly, breathing easier without understanding why. A knock echoed gently against the apartment door exactly at 6 o'clock. Sophie gasped dramatically. "Restaurant man." Claire tried unsuccessfully to hide her smile while wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You know his name." "I like restaurant man better." Claire opened the door to find Ethan standing there holding 2 grocery bags and wearing a dark wool coat dusted lightly with snow. The cold evening air followed him inside briefly before the warmth of the apartment wrapped around all 3 of them again. Ethan lifted the bags slightly. "Your heater repairman said the building pipes are older than the Constitution." Claire blinked in surprise. "You called the repairman?" Ethan removed his gloves carefully. "The apartment was freezing last week." Sophie ran toward the grocery bags immediately. "Did you bring snacks?" Ethan crouched slightly beside her. "I was informed this apartment lacks proper hot chocolate supplies." Sophie gasped louder this time. "Mommy, he is learning." Claire folded her arms loosely while watching them. It still unsettled her sometimes how naturally Ethan fit into small moments like these. Like he had been slowly finding his place inside their routine, one ordinary evening at a time. No grand gestures. No expensive apologies. Just presence. Ethan set groceries onto the kitchen counter while Sophie inspected everything with complete seriousness. "Mini marshmallows," she whispered reverently. "He really is rich." Ethan looked toward Claire. "I feel judged." Claire shook her head softly, unable to fully suppress the warmth rising quietly in her chest. Over the last few weeks, Ethan had started appearing in the spaces between their survival. School pickups when Claire worked late shifts. Coffee left outside her apartment door before dawn. Sitting through Sophie's school rehearsal while wearing a $7,000 coat beside exhausted parents carrying folding chairs and juice boxes. He never complained, never acted above any of it. And somehow that mattered more than money ever could. Sophie suddenly climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs while holding scissors dangerously close to her sweater sleeve. "Daddy says billionaires are bad at wrapping presents." The apartment went still for one tiny suspended second. "Daddy." The word landed naturally from Sophie now. Without hesitation. Without fear. Ethan froze beside the counter while Claire instinctively looked toward him. Something vulnerable crossed his expression so quickly Claire almost missed it entirely. Then Sophie frowned. "What?" Claire swallowed carefully. "Nothing, sweetheart." But Ethan had already turned away slightly, pretending to organize groceries while emotion quietly wrecked him from the inside. Later that evening, snow tapped softly against the apartment windows while Christmas music played low from an old radio near the couch. Sophie had fallen asleep halfway through hot chocolate, curled beneath blankets with marshmallows still floating in her mug. Ethan lowered the volume carefully before sitting beside Claire on the couch. The apartment glowed softly beneath yellow Christmas lights Sophie insisted on hanging too early every year. Claire tucked loose hair behind one ear while staring toward the window. "She called you Daddy." Ethan looked down briefly at his hands. "I noticed." Silence settled between them comfortably this time. Not awkward. Just quiet in the way peaceful things often were. Claire glanced toward him carefully. "Does it scare you?" Ethan looked up immediately. "What?" "Being needed." The question lingered between them longer than expected. Ethan leaned back slowly against the couch cushions. "Honestly." Claire nodded once. He looked toward sleeping Sophie across the room. "Terrifies me." Claire watched him quietly. Ethan exhaled softly before continuing. "Boardrooms do not scare me. Investors do not scare me. Losing billions in negotiations does not scare me." His voice lowered. But her trusting me does. Claire's chest tightened unexpectedly. Ethan looked down at the half-empty mug, warming his hands. Because now I understand how badly I could hurt her if I fail. Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then very softly she said, "The fact that you are afraid probably means you will not." Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. The tired softness in her face beneath Christmas lights. The woman who spent 6 years carrying responsibilities never meant for one person alone. "How did you do it?" he asked quietly. Claire frowned slightly. "Do what?" "All of this." He gestured gently toward the apartment. "Sophie asleep nearby. The life she built from almost nothing. Without anyone helping you." Claire looked down at her hands. "Some days I did not do it well." Ethan remained silent. Claire smiled faintly, though sadness touched the edges of it. "There were nights I cried in the bathroom because Sophie needed new shoes and I only had enough money for groceries." Her voice stayed calm, but fragile now. "And there were birthdays where I wrapped thrift store toys like they came from Fifth Avenue, because I wanted her to feel normal." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Claire continued softer. "But every morning she smiled at me like I was enough." Silence filled the apartment again, heavy with truths neither of them could undo anymore. Ethan looked towards Sophie sleeping beneath crooked Christmas lights and whispered quietly, "You were enough." Claire blinked rapidly at the sudden ache behind her eyes. Outside, snow continued falling over Manhattan in slow, quiet waves while taxis moved beneath glowing city lights far below. Ethan shifted slightly closer without realizing it. Claire noticed the warmth of his shoulder beside hers immediately. Neither moved away. "Claire," Ethan said softly after a long silence. She looked toward him. His voice lowered carefully. "I do not know how to repair 6 years." Claire stared at him quietly beneath the soft gold glow of the apartment. Then finally, honestly, she whispered, "Maybe you stop trying to repair the past and just stay for what comes next." Ethan looked at her like the sentence had changed something fundamental inside him. And for the first time since that snowy night at the restaurant, Claire realized they were no longer standing on opposite sides of pain. Slowly, quietly, they were beginning to stand beside each other instead. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in soft snowfall and quiet city lights. Manhattan glowed beneath silver decorations hanging across crowded avenues, while church bells echoed faintly between skyscrapers disappearing into the winter sky. Inside Claire's apartment, warmth pressed gently against the windows fogged by cold outside air. Cinnamon candles flickered beside the tiny artificial Christmas tree Sophie insisted on decorating with paper stars and crooked candy canes. Old jazz music drifted softly from the radio while grilled cheese sandwiches cooled forgotten on the counter because Sophie had become too excited to eat. "Daddy is late," she announced dramatically while kneeling on the couch near the window. Claire glanced toward the clock. 6:27. Ethan had texted saying an investor meeting ran longer than expected. Normally that sentence would not have surprised her. Men like Ethan spent their lives trapped inside conference rooms and endless negotiations. But lately he had started leaving meetings early for school rehearsals and hot chocolate nights in tiny apartments with uneven heating. Claire noticed things like that now. Sophie pressed her nose against the window glass. "Rich people meetings sound boring." Claire smiled faintly while untangling Christmas lights. "Most meetings are boring. Then why does Daddy go to so many?" Claire paused briefly before answering. "Because sometimes people spend years building lives they forget how to step away from." Sophie frowned thoughtfully at that. Before she could ask another impossible question, a knock echoed softly through the apartment. Sophie gasped. "The billionaire has arrived." Claire laughed quietly despite herself while opening the door. Ethan stood there holding snow-covered bakery boxes in one hand and a paper bag in the other. Cold air followed him briefly inside, while snow melted across the shoulders of his dark coat. But what caught Claire off guard was not the gifts. It was his face. Tired. Distracted. Something heavy sat behind his eyes tonight. Sophie ran toward him immediately. "You missed tree decorating." Ethan crouched slightly to hug her carefully. "I brought emergency cookies as a peace offering." Sophie considered this seriously before nodding. "Acceptable." Claire closed the door quietly behind him. "Long meeting." Ethan looked toward her while removing his gloves slowly. "Long family dinner." Claire noticed the tension immediately. "Your mother?" Ethan nodded once. Sophie was already digging through the bakery boxes with dangerous excitement. "Mommy, he bought the expensive cookies again." Ethan smiled faintly at that, but the expression disappeared quickly. Claire watched him carefully while Sophie carried cookies toward the couch like priceless treasure. What happened? Ethan hesitated before answering. My mother wants to meet Sophie. The apartment went still. Christmas music continued softly in the background while snow drifted against the windows outside. Claire folded her arms instinctively. Why now? Ethan leaned quietly against the counter. Because she finally understands Sophie exists beyond old decisions. Claire looked away toward the tree lights blinking softly near the couch. 6 years of anger did not disappear simply because wealthy people developed guilt during the holidays. Ethan seemed to understand her silence immediately. I am not asking you to forgive her. Claire looked back at him sharply. Then what are you asking? Ethan's expression softened painfully. I am asking you not to punish Sophie for our mistakes. Sophie suddenly appeared beside them, holding frosting across one cheek. Who are we punishing? Ethan gently wiped frosting from her face with his thumb. Nobody, sweetheart. Sophie narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Adults always say that right before feelings happen. Claire nearly laughed despite the tension tightening her chest. Ethan looked toward Sophie quietly then. How would you feel about meeting my mother sometime? Sophie blinked once. Like rich grandma. Ethan smiled softly, for real this time. Something like that. Sophie considered the idea very seriously while chewing cookie frosting. Does she like cartoons? Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire before answering honestly. I do not know. Sophie nodded slowly. Okay, but if she is mean to mommy, I am leaving. Silence settled immediately after the sentence. Claire felt emotion rise so suddenly she had to look away. Ethan stared at Sophie carefully, like he still could not fully believe this child belonged to him. That is fair, he whispered softly. Later that evening, snow continued falling heavily while Sophie slept curled beneath Christmas blankets beside the glowing tree lights. The apartment remained warm and quiet except for the soft hum of the old heater rattling unevenly through the walls. Claire stood near the kitchen sink washing mugs while Ethan dried dishes beside her in complete silence. A billionaire drying dishes inside a tiny apartment. Life became strange sometimes. You keep doing that, Claire said quietly after a while. Ethan glanced toward her. Doing what? Looking at Sophie like you are afraid she might disappear. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the dish towel in his hands. Maybe I am. Claire stopped washing dishes then. Ethan leaned against the counter slowly, exhaustion finally visible beneath all the expensive control he usually wore so carefully. Claire, every morning I wake up realizing I lost 6 years with her. His voice stayed calm, but fragile underneath. And then I remember she still smiles when she sees me anyway. Claire watched him quietly. Ethan looked toward the small living room where Sophie slept beneath colored lights. I do not know what I did to deserve that kind of grace. Claire dried her hands slowly on the towel beside the sink. Children love before they understand consequences. Ethan swallowed hard at that. And you? The question hung softly between them. Claire looked toward the window instead of answering immediately. Snow drifted beyond the glass while Manhattan glowed quietly beneath Christmas lights far below. Finally, she whispered, I spent years trying not to love you. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. Claire looked down at her hands carefully. It would have been easier if you were cruel. Easier if you actually abandoned us. Her voice softened painfully. But now I know you did not. Ethan stepped slightly closer without realizing it. Claire. She shook her head gently before he could continue. That does not erase what happened. I know. Silence again. Warm. Heavy. Honest. Ethan studied her face beneath the soft yellow kitchen light. I am not asking for forgiveness tonight. Claire finally looked at him then. What are you asking for? Ethan's voice lowered carefully. A chance to stop being a stranger in my daughter's life. Claire's eyes glistened faintly despite herself. Outside, church bells echoed midnight through the snowy city while Christmas lights reflected softly against the apartment walls. And standing there beside dishes and fading candlelight, Claire realized something terrifying. Somewhere between the grief and the lost years and the tiny, ordinary moments Ethan kept showing up for, she had started believing him. The first snowfall after Christmas arrived quietly over Manhattan, covering the city in soft white silence while yellow taxi lights blurred against frozen streets below. Inside Claire's apartment, the tiny Christmas tree still glowed in the corner because Sophie refused to let anyone take it down yet. It is emotionally attached to the room now. she had explained very seriously 2 days earlier. Claire smiled faintly at the memory while buttoning her winter coat near the doorway. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor wearing a red scarf much too long for her small frame while coloring another impossible fish with purple markers. Ethan stood beside the kitchen counter stirring hot chocolate. He had somehow learned to make exactly the way Sophie liked it. Extra marshmallows. Too much cinnamon. Tiny apartment routines had become strangely natural for him now. Daddy burns the milk less than Mommy, Sophie announced without looking up. Claire narrowed her eyes immediately. I carried you for 9 months. Sophie shrugged calmly. And he stirs better. Ethan tried unsuccessfully not to laugh. Claire pointed toward him dramatically. Do not encourage this betrayal. The apartment filled with warmth after that. Quiet laughter. The smell of chocolate and cinnamon. Snow tapping softly against old windows. For the first time in years, Claire realized she no longer dreaded winter evenings. They no longer felt empty. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Ethan's expression shifted immediately. That will be my mother. Sophie gasped. Rich grandma. Claire inhaled slowly before opening the door. Margaret Calloway stood in the hallway wrapped in an elegant cream coat, with snowflakes melting softly into silver hair. But unlike the sharp, composed woman Claire remembered from months earlier, Margaret looked nervous tonight. Genuinely nervous. Her eyes moved immediately towards Sophie, sitting beside the tree lights. Sophie looked back curiously while holding a purple marker against her cheek. Hello, Margaret said softly. Sophie tilted her head. You look like Daddy when he worries. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Margaret blinked once before laughing quietly despite herself. I suppose that is fair. Claire stepped aside silently, allowing her inside. Margaret moved carefully through the apartment, studying every detail with quiet attention. The second-hand furniture. Sophie's school drawings taped beside the refrigerator. The tiny Christmas tree glowing bravely in the corner despite missing half its ornaments. For a woman raised inside penthouses and private estates, the apartment should have looked small. But somehow Margaret only looked sad. Sophie eventually stood and approached her carefully. Daddy says you like classical music. Margaret looked surprised. He said that. Sophie nodded proudly. Mommy likes old jazz songs because they sound lonely but pretty. Claire suddenly became very interested in fixing scarves that did not need fixing. Margaret looked toward her quietly for one suspended moment before returning her attention to Sophie. And what kind of music do you like? Sophie grinned instantly. Cartoon songs and Taylor Swift. Ethan muttered softly. An impossible generation. Margaret surprised all of them by smiling warmly. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. The tension inside the apartment loosened slightly after that. Sophie showed Margaret her drawings. Ethan made more hot chocolate than any human beings realistically needed. And slowly, carefully, conversation replaced old silence. Claire watched from the kitchen while Margaret sat beside Sophie, listening seriously to an explanation about why purple fish deserved emotional support. It would have been easier if Margaret acted cruel. Easier if she stayed cold and untouchable. But regrets soften people in uncomfortable ways. Later that evening, Sophie fell asleep beneath the Christmas lights halfway through explaining fish personalities for the third time. Ethan carried her carefully toward the bedroom, while Claire quietly gathered mugs from the coffee table. Margaret stood near the apartment window, looking out over snowy Manhattan streets below. She has your kindness, Margaret said softly once Ethan disappeared down the hallway. Claire kept stacking dishes without answering. Margaret turned slowly toward her. And my son's eyes. Silence stretched gently between them. Finally, Margaret stepped closer. I owe you more apologies than I can possibly say correctly. Claire looked down at the mugs in her hands. Apologies do not return time. Margaret nodded immediately. I know. Her voice trembled faintly now. That is what keeps me awake. Claire looked toward the bedroom where Ethan had disappeared carrying Sophie. Why did you really stop us from contacting him? Margaret lowered her gaze. Because I spent my entire life watching powerful families destroy women like you. Claire frowned slightly. Margaret continued quietly. I convinced myself distance would protect everyone. A sad smile touched her lips. Instead, I created loneliness for all of you. Claire studied her carefully. Wealth could hide many things, but not regret this deep. Ethan returned quietly a moment later, loosening the sleeves of his sweater after settling Sophie into bed. Margaret looked toward her son, and something vulnerable crossed her face. Your father would have loved her. Ethan swallowed hard, but nodded once. The apartment grew quiet again after that. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, while jazz music played softly from the old radio near the couch. Margaret eventually reached for her coat. I should let you all rest. Sophie's sleepy voice suddenly echoed faintly from the bedroom hallway. Grandma. All three adults turned immediately. Sophie stood there rubbing one eye while clutching her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. Margaret froze completely. Sophie yawned softly before asking, Are you coming back again? Margaret's composure broke instantly beneath the simplest question in the world. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. If you would like me to, she whispered. Sophie nodded sleepily. Okay, but next time we are watching cartoons. Ethan looked away briefly, overwhelmed by the fragile beauty of the moment unfolding in front of him. Claire watched quietly too. 6 years ago, one decision built from fear shattered everything that could have been. But tonight, inside a tiny apartment glowing beneath Christmas lights and soft snowfall, healing finally looked possible. Not because anyone forgot the pain, but because sometimes love arrived after damage already existed and chose to stay anyway. Ethan crossed the room slowly then, standing beside Claire near the window while Margaret helped Sophie back toward bed. Their shoulders brushed lightly together in the warm yellow light. Neither moved away. And somewhere deep beneath the grief and regret and lost years, something new finally began to feel stronger than the past.